I'll introduce you. So just tell me, you teach entrepreneurship, you've done entrepreneurship. So tell me about that process, like teaching entrepreneurship. What are some core values to entrepreneurship, being an entrepreneur that you teach your students?
One of the things that we teach students is that entrepreneurship is more about mindset, so that you don't always have to create a new business. A lot of people think entrepreneurship is creating a new business and that's it, but you can have an entrepreneurial mindset in all the things that you do. In the case of, whether that's failing and failing fast, trying new things, being something new or innovative, novel, taking a novel approach. There's just lots of characteristics of entrepreneurs, like, again, creating something innovative, being willing to take risk and fail. And many companies are doing that as well in existing companies. So that's the notion of entrepreneurship, or behaving entrepreneurially within an existing organization. So I think people think entrepreneurship is only about starting a business, but that's not necessarily the case. That you can behave entrepreneurial even if you are doing other things, right? So that's those characteristics, like being willing to take risks, things that are new and different, embrace failure, persevere, things like that.
How dramatically does digital media change the ability to do that as opposed to legacy media?
So on one hand, it reduces the barriers to entry. So if you look at things like the internet, that enables new technologies, that enables new ventures. Whereas, in the context of journalism, for example, the barriers to entry were high before digital existed. Even in an analog context, a 1 minute video on a 2400-bit modem would take, a long time to watch. It would take more than a minute. It would take multiple minutes, if not longer. And so the digital aspects of reducing the bandwidth, reducing broadband, that enable things that reduce the barriers of entry. You don't have to have a printing press. You don't have to have distribution of cars and paper that would cost, lots of sums of money. So the largest thing from digital media, is that it reduced the barriers to entry, so that anyone could do so for cheap or low cost. And then it sped up the delivery as well, right? So like a newspaper example would take the next day till you get yesterday's news. Now you get communication instantly in the forms of that. So for digital media entrepreneurship opportunities, the biggest takeaways would be the reduction of barriers to entry, and then kind of the speed of the delivery and the opportunities you can do there are not limited by physical assets.
Nice, and you mentioned entrepreneurship. Some companies are better about that than others, including some surprising companies. For example, IBM files multiple patents, hundreds. I think I'll do an edit here. Sorry.
Don't die.
Don't drop the camera if you die. Some companies are more intrapreneurial than others, including some surprising companies. IBM, for example, files hundreds and thousands of new patents regularly. How important is that culture? Can you do it without that support, or do you have to have that support, or are there two ways to do it?
There's multiple ways. So like Google is famous for their 10% time, where 10% of your time as an employee can be focused on anything you want to do. From the tech space, a lot of companies will do hackathons or weekends or dedicated time to try things. In some cases, there's parameters around it. It's, like, we're going to tackle this problem, and we're going to bring interdisciplinary teams together to do so. So that's really helpful, that culture of hacking or hackathon or development. The other thing that you see is, like, from a corporate entrepreneurship perspective, many companies, so one of two things. One is you can basically create a spin-off division where you're competing against yourself. So you're creating an entirely different company to compete against the established brand, and you might not even know that it's owned by whatever. You just think, oh, this thing's competing and whatnot. So that's one. And the other thing you could do is foster that throughout. And so many might have accelerators or formal programs that employees maybe have to apply for, get accepted to, that is structured like a startup would be, in terms of, like, an accelerator program typically is 12 to 15 weeks. Usually there's funding provided in return for equity. Usually there's mentoring. And so you see these corporate companies doing one of two things. One, like moving out of the division, competing against themselves, or bringing it internally and opening those opportunities to all, or kind of an application process. They can bring outside ideas into that fold. And so some also will either do it internally or they outsource it to those, if entrepreneurship, that have an established record like Techstars. So for example, I think Techstars, it runs Comcast program. They have one called The Farm, which is their media entrepreneurship accelerator program. Comcast also has a partnership with Adidas in sports. So some of these media companies have also tried innovation accelerator programs and they failed. Turner was one of the first with Media Camp that only lasted a few years, unfortunately. A company like Disney, they brought in outside company and invested. The little robot that was in the Disney movie that was like, I forget the name, BB something, that was a startup that came out of their accelerator program. So you see it in a number of different programs, but accelerators are common. And then, like I said before, some of the things like hackathons, 10% time, letting employees work on any of their own ideas, even if it doesn't relate to the core mission.
So a hackathon is a great idea. I've been part of a couple of those. They are really focused on sort of the product, the code. What are some important steps outside of that people might not pay enough attention to? So for example, researching a potential market for an
Well, so
idea.
the term hackathon's a bit of a misnomer where, again, it was for what you were saying, but now it's being used to apply to a bunch of things where they're not necessarily like focusing on hacking. They just took the term. One example, government has done it where here's a problem that the city is going to focus on. This is the parameters of what we're looking at. So design thinking is some concepts that are usually done in it. Part of that is get out of the building, is using entrepreneurial parlance, where you'll go talk to customers, do customer discovery. If you're using lean methodology, you would typically do problem interviews. That would lead to you identifying problems and who it's a problem for. So creating a customer persona. And I like to use that definition because, so for example, let's say your hypothesis is around technology, and you say that senior citizens are the people who have difficulty using certain technological issues. That's only a problem using a remote or an alarm for senior citizens, and maybe you go even further, senior citizens in a nursing home. That wouldn't be a problem in theory for like a 22-year-old, right? So that's where a problem for some isn't a problem for others. So you have to specify, and you're going to do research with those who you think it's a problem for. That's where you create a customer empathy map or persona and sort of segment the audience. And if you learn that that's not the case, then maybe you will try a different customer segment and do research there. So once you've defined something as a problem, then you would create a prototype that would address those problems. You could do solution interviews, doing again lean startup methodology, running lean, that kind of thing. So again, interviews, empathy maps, design thinking, ideation. Many of these things happen like in a condensed, accelerated period of 2 to 3 days in a hackathon. That's why they call it that, because it's consolidated and interdisciplinary. Often we'll bring people that have the skill sets, the technical skills. Usually in the startup parlance, what you want, they say that you want a team of at least 3 people, and they say you need a hipster, a hacker, and a hustler. So the hustler is the business savvy, the hacker obviously is the technical skills, typically the CTO, and the hipster tends to be the creative, the design thinking. So you can see design elements, business elements, and the technical skills that you want.
That's new to me. I love that description.
Yeah.
You mentioned partnership. The city of Atlanta has one of these that you've taken advantage of. So investment from governments, from states, from federal governments, so from municipalities. So how do you take advantage of those funding opportunities?
I'm stripping just because it relates to the question you're asking.
I figured as much, yeah, so I love this.
So yeah, This is Atlanta Tech Village. Home is where your startup is. That's the state of Georgia.
Great.
And Atlanta Tech Village is the largest co-working space in the country, 4th largest in the country, largest in the Southeast. And so it's an office building, several floors, and they have startups that come through there, and then they graduate where they can no longer have too many employees to be there, but they provide a startup chow down, which is a community that meets every week at the village. They eat for free if you're a member there. They provide pitch practice every week, so you can go and practice an elevator pitch, a more formal pitch for pitch competition. And they also do startup summer school. They do free workshops. They have other communities like women entrepreneurs. And so within the community, they have people that you would need to grow a business. So like lawyers, the law skills, marketing companies, design things. Those usually have a space at the village. So usually these co-working spaces offer services, and then they build like cohorts, right? So you have people that are there with you that grow and scale with you, and then ideally you get on that graduate wall. That means you've made it, and then maybe, or you haven't made it and you've reinvested in it. So not every place is like that, but many communities that have an ecosystem tend to have co-working spaces, tend to have accelerator programs, tend to have places that entrepreneurs can congregate. Many have university town gown programs as well. So many universities will have these programs that bring in outside people and resources. I forget exactly your question, but yeah, in an ecosystem, you want exposure and access to a variety of people that complement your skill sets.
No, that's it, to pursue existing opportunities. So,
Yep.
you know, like an ecosystem is something that I talk about, and I give examples about it in a lecture on ecosystems forming in new places, especially in like Europe and Asia and elsewhere.
And that's exactly it. So the access to capital is what important. Atlanta is known for diversity. It's obviously an urban city with a large minority population. And so that's one of the things we've seen grow out of Atlanta recently. Pre-accelerator programs, Zane Venture Fund, Google had the Google Black funders that they offered access to, money for. And so one thing that grew out of Atlanta's ecosystem is Panoramic Ventures, funded by Paul Judge, who's an investor in Atlanta. And that grew, happened about a year ago. They launched a venture that goes all around the country. Startup Battle, I think is the name of it. And some of these have similar names, but basically it's a competition, it's a pitch competition that usually has 4 or 5 ventures, and they're competing for about $100,000, $200,000, and then they get equity in exchange of that. But so that's a new one that grew during the pandemic, Panoramic Ventures, and it's largely specifically for underrepresented entrepreneurs. So that's something you're seeing in Atlanta's ecosystem, is it's growing and creating funding specifically for underrepresented entrepreneurs like women, minorities, and so you're seeing that nationally as well, like the Google Fund, that one specifically for Black founders, and then there's other initiatives that are for like indigenous communities and others. So you're seeing nationally organizations put funding behind it, but you also have funding in local communities. That's part of the ecosystem and networking. Atlanta Tech Village has a similar version of like the Startup Battle, but it's not for money, it's just for access to Tech Village. It's once a month, and that's in person and virtually. Pizza, free beer, all these kind of things. But that's where you meet, and they're very friendly. So they'll say after the pitch, "Can anyone help them? How can you help them? Raise your hand, meet them afterwards." So that's where the networking comes in, the startup chowdowns, and the village is good in Atlanta. You need to get Atlanta in the sense of it's one of the largest. So
amazing. And how important is it to have funding from members of underrepresented communities making some of those decisions, making that capital available?
It's important because, like, if you look at the studies, Kauffman Foundation has done a lot of studies on this, and I don't know the exact percentage, but it's under 10%. Of minorities get hardly any of the funding. Most of the funding goes to white folks, basically, and a lot of the funding historically went to just Silicon Valley. So like Steve Case did his Rise of the Rest Tour. Steve Case was the founder of America Online, so it relates to what we were talking about earlier, digital media, back before, for those that don't know Steve Case, but he created the Rise of the Rest Tour with the idea that you go and focus, and he also has prize money associated with these tours that go to places all around the country that are not Silicon Valley. Specifically for underrepresented entrepreneurs, there's a reason that's a movement toward that, because historically they haven't been able to have access to funding because of those traditional things and particular industries that were funded. A lot of times minority entrepreneurs are less likely to be like in the tech space, and when we talk about funding traditionally, like Silicon Valley is around high tech industries. Now, it doesn't mean Atlanta or others don't have that. In fact, Calendly is a unicorn that is a tech company that grew out of Atlanta. It's funded in Atlanta. Spanx is not tech, but that also was founded in Atlanta by a female. So that she's a white woman, but she was as a woman, she would be considered underrepresented entrepreneur. Sarah Blakely. So Atlanta's had a few unicorn successes. Unicorn, of course, is $1 billion valuation or more, not like a horned mythical creature. Although I think there's the parallels that there is rare is that in many cases to obtain that. So what traditionally you have with like black communities, for example, what we see is more Main Street businesses, more small businesses, things like hair care products. One of the most famous African American entrepreneurs was Madam Walker, who created hair care line for minorities back in the 1900s. And so you tend to see a lot of minority entrepreneurs creating those kind of areas that then traditionally wouldn't receive funding. And so that's the other thing is like in the tech space, when you're funding a venture, not all ventures are scalable and not all ventures are fundable. And so a lot of times would-be funders refer to the business I mentioned as a lifestyle business, and they do so to throw shade. Like, you don't want to be just a lifestyle business, you want to be a scalable business that can grow and scale, but it's called a lifestyle business, which means you can make a living off of it if you don't have intentions to, grow. Maybe you're just in Atlanta, or maybe you're just one small town, and that's fine because you're able to make a living off of it. So that's why I think traditionally many of the ventures from minorities were not funded because they were in industries largely that were not funded, and just you have all these institutional and historical barriers to get access. So to see funds specifically for persons of color and women in particular, and indigenous communities, and sometimes BIPOC is included in that, is huge, and I think you'll see more and more of that. But it has to be organic and fit the need of the community. It wouldn't make sense to offer, an underrepresented fund in a community that's like 98% white, for example. So Atlanta is a minority urban environment, and so it makes sense there.
And I think as we get more successful entrepreneurs from these industries, they'll invest back first as angel investors and then elsewhere. And you're seeing that already in Atlanta. So
you see that from media people. You see that with musicians and producers that come from Atlanta. Ludacris is an alum of Georgia State. Well, he never graduated, but he attended Georgia State, and he recently got an honorary degree. And so Christopher Ludacris Bridges, of course, was a famous, began as a rapper, but now has invested in other ventures. And you see that throughout Atlanta. Killer Mike is another famous rapper that also invests in the community. He owns several barbershops. You have athletes that live in Atlanta, like Shaquille O'Neal, who has invested as a deal and owns several Papa John's franchises. So you see people, celebrities that come from Atlanta that branch out into entrepreneurship and other investments. They also give back to the community and it builds. So Christopher Bridges, Ludacris, was an artist in residence at Georgia State where he attended, an entrepreneur in residence as well, and has been in classes and stuff. So.
Anything I didn't ask that you'd like to add, either about entrepreneurship or teaching entrepreneurship? Or tips for students?
Teaching entrepreneurship is fun. Entrepreneurship is fun and sexy, so you see more and more programs with it. I think the main thing with entrepreneurship is that you can forge a new path, you can create something new and different. And I guess tips would be, don't be afraid. So one of the things I do in my entrepreneurship class is I do a thing called a fail-fair activity, modeled around, if you're familiar with TED Talks, there's a thing called FailCon, which is basically TED Talks for failure, where speakers talk about failures and lessons they learned from it. So when I say fail, I don't mean fail the class, I don't mean fail the assignment, but I mean, learn from failure. They say failure is an acronym for first attempt in learning. So if you look at it as a learning opportunity and not like something that, this can't be overcome, I think one of the biggest traits for entrepreneurs is the ability to tolerate ambiguity and the ability to take risk. So, part of failing is the ability and willingness to fail and recover from it if you process what you learned. You can also have bad failure where you don't process what you learned, where you don't ever take responsibility. And we see that with certain politicians. We see that with certain, examples where they're never to blame, right? There was an old rapper called Master P whose famous song was, "It Ain't My Fault," right? So you don't want to be Master P, you want to accept responsibility and learn from it. So think of failure as a learning opportunity and use that for entrepreneurship to, kick ass, change the world, make a difference, and create something that provides value to people that never existed in the world before.